All right, good evening, everyone. Um, I'll welcome you to the presentation of the Behavioral Crisis by Joseph Merz and his colleagues. Joseph will introduce himself and his colleagues, and I'll just make a few initial comments about some instrumental things. There seems to be some sort of bug that has created and changed people's names on your view. So if your name is not appearing as it should, would you please change it to your actual name that you'd like to be identified by? The other thing we're going to ask you to do is to ensure that you are mute throughout the presentation, and we can unmute you at the question and answer period. And also, just to save bandwidth and power for everyone and the system, would ask you to stop your video, turn your video off, because you don't really need that unless you're asking a question or you want to be seen later in the Q&A. This session is being recorded, so everyone should realize that it's being recorded. That's already being done. And unlike the first time we did the session, which presented a difficulty because it was a terrific session and we failed to record it properly. So we're doing it this time, and it'll be available for later viewing and spreading around. So without any further comments, I'll turn it over to Joseph to introduce himself and the rest of the team. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm not sure if you can see me or not. I can only see Jack. Hang on, I'll just see if... Can you see me, Jack?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay, all right, great. So yeah, I'm really thrilled to be here. And as you know, or some of you will know, I'm Joseph Merz. I'm the chairman of Merz Institute, which is a research institute that focuses largely on ecological overshoot. I'm also a senior fellow of the Global Evergreening Alliance, and I'm on the executive committee of the Stable Planet Alliance. I'll just hand over briefly to Nandita and Matt to introduce themselves, if you're happy to do that, you two.
After you, Nandita.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Nandita Bajaj. I am the executive director of a US-based nonprofit called Population Balance. And at Population Balance, we work towards inspiring narrative, behavior, and system change to help downscale both our population and consumption. And I also teach as senior faculty at the Institute for Humane Education at Antioch University.
Wonderful. Hi, my name's Matt. I worked in advertising until very recently. Now I do a lot of work with Joseph on this sort of thing. My advertising career spanned 20 or so years across 15 markets, with most of the big holding companies. And one of the themes today is going to be kind of collaboration between new types of people. And I see great opportunity in connecting my world as it was and yours collectively as it is now. So we'll talk about more of that in a bit.
Wonderful, thank you both. So when I first started the Institute, the objective was really to pull together a wide range of siloed scientific disciplines, because I noticed there was very little communication between a bunch of really critical disciplines. And I thought that stitching those together would help me better understand what was occurring globally, or us better understand that, and it really did. And so after a year or so of what were essentially crash courses from leading scientists around the world, which I was very fortunate to receive in a whole range of disciplines. I became somewhat obsessed with the root cause of our predicament, which is anthropogenic ecological overshoot. And ultimately, this work led me and a few of my colleagues to publish the peer-reviewed paper, World Scientists Warning the Behavioral Crisis Driving Ecological Overshoot. I figure a good number of you have probably read the paper by now. It's the response has been incredible, far more wonderful than I had hoped. The last time, to give you an idea, the last time we gave this presentation, the paper was in the top 2%, or it had an attention score in the top 2% of all tracked academic research, and it was approaching 12,000 reads and downloads, and I was very excited about that. And now it's a few months later, and it's in the top 1%, and it's at 53,000 reads and downloads. And it's been covered by a whole bunch of pretty mainstream outlets, which is fantastic. So thank you to anyone and everyone who supported it. The problem was that even by the time the paper was submitted, our work on what we've termed the behavioral crisis had progressed well beyond the scope of the paper. And so tonight I'm going to provide a brief overview of ecological overshoot. And then I'm going to talk about behavior in relation to overshoot. The term we use for this is the behavioral crisis. I'll talk very briefly on a few of the drivers of the behavioral crisis and something that Matt and Nandita will go into more detail on. And lastly, I'll talk about addressing the behavioral crisis and some important considerations for doing that. But it essentially all starts with overshoot. Overshoot has a range of symptoms that we know of and we're seeing all around us. Climate change is just one of these. There's ocean acidification and biodiversity loss, which leads to ecosystem collapse and all sorts of other things. So there's a huge range of these things, these symptoms of overshoot. And I'd really like to go into more detail on these, but unfortunately we won't have time today. So in the paper, we define overshoot as the human consumption of natural resources at rates faster than they can be replenished and entropic waste production in excess of Earth's assimilative and processing capacity. And previously, large expansions of the human enterprise were held in check by negative feedback in the form of resource depletion and disease. But in the last few hundred years, that all changed. Our access to easy energy in the form of fossil fuels has enabled us to reduce those negative feedbacks. And subsequently, our population and our consumption and our waste has gone through the roof and has led us into the state of ecological overshoot. I mentioned population, consumption, and waste. I call these the three levers of overshoot, and I say they're worth remembering. They're really handy and we keep coming back to them. There are some really remarkable figures when it comes to highlighting just how anomalous the past few hundred years have been for Homo sapiens, and increasingly the broader ecosphere. To me, the most remarkable are the figures surrounding population growth, and Nandita will run through these, I believe. Our colleague Bill Rees often says that our species is in the late stage of a one-off boom-bust cycle. And I think anyone with a basic understanding of ecology would find it difficult to disagree with that. While our access to energy enables overshoot, it's undoubtedly human behavior that drives it. The behaviors driving overshoot, or what we refer to in the Institute as overshoot behaviors, are now displayed and exploited to the extent that collectively they constitute what we've termed the human behavioral crisis. In the paper, we refer to this specifically to mean the consequences of the innate suite of human behaviors that were once adaptive in early hominid evolution, but have reached the point now where, or they've been exploited to serve the global industrial economy. And that's the definition we use in the paper. In reality, it's evolving all the time. And yeah, like I said, by the time the paper had gone to had been published, we'd already that had already sort of changed a little bit. The main thing to understand is that in its most rudimentary form, overshoot is a physical problem. It's the physical result of our physical behaviors. And at present, these behaviors are the product of a whole raft of things, including that intentional exploitation that I highlighted above. Nandita and Matt will talk about two of these drivers, as I said, that we highlight in the paper. But essentially, our behaviors come down to our biology and our environment. And the most progressive movements I see at the moment speak of changing attitudes and beliefs and values as if they're synonymous with behaviors or with our behaviors. Of course, these play a role in influencing our behaviors, but as lots of things do, but they're not the same thing. And what I mean by this is changing our attitudes doesn't guarantee a specific behavioral outcome. We need to reverse a few hundred years of geoengineering and degradation, and that came about from easy to perform, hugely beneficial behaviors. So our understanding is that it's going to require the widespread adoption of comparatively easy, beneficial, and quite specific behaviors. And those specific behaviors, as I said, won't come about by simply changing values or changing attitudes. They'll come about by designing what is needed to perform at our ecological peak, so to speak, and anchoring ourselves in the science surrounding behavior change. So in other words, we need to start designing the future at a behavioral level. And once we know what this looks like, we can begin to work backwards from there, informed by the science to bring that about. In the past, we haven't had to think about our behaviors in the way we do now. And maladaptive behaviors, this is something I say quite a lot, but maladaptive behaviors could exist without existential consequences. And that's what our population has changed. The specific behaviors that or essentially because of our population now, our maladaptive behaviors do have existential consequences. So another way of putting that is there's no margin left anymore for maladaptive behaviors. The specific behaviors that we collectively display over the coming decades will be critical to the survival of not only our species, but millions of other species and potentially all complex life on Earth. So imagine if we did design the social norms and social boundaries that drive our behaviors in relation to overshoot. And if we design them to be as ecologically restorative and beneficial as possible. And I'm not talking simply about curbing behaviors that we see as necessary to meet our needs through the lens of the current paradigm. Doing that, to me, would likely build a multitude of redundancies and inefficiencies into the new behaviors. And as I've sort of implied above, our idea of needs through the current paradigm is severely distorted. So this is, as Bill Rees often says, our colleague Bill Rees often says, this is the single most anomalous period in human history. And we should be extremely, well, I always add to what he says by saying we should be extremely cautious about anything we consider normal right now. In saying that, I am yet to see anything that says that it isn't possible for us to behaviorally design our norms. What we don't know is whether, what we don't know is what an ecologically beneficial and restorative future would look like in terms of behavior. It's surprising to say that, but that's because our ideas of what's normal and our needs are so distorted through the current paradigm that every time we try and imagine that, we don't even realize, but we pull all of this superfluous stuff through with it. So it's remarkable that that work hasn't been done in a more comprehensive way, or we haven't been able to find it anyway. And some people shiver at the thought of that level of behavioral control. But we really do have this illusion of behavioral freedom or free will, and it simply doesn't exist. We think that where we aren't being manipulated, we're free. but we aren't. We're just behaving in accordance with a range of factors that we tend not to think about or know about. So this is part of what Matt, myself, Cody, and an ever-growing list of others have been working on in the Institute through our Overshoot Behaviour Lab and our future Behaviour Lab, which will hopefully be launching soon. And there's a lot more I could say on this topic. I would have loved to talk about the mechanisms for changing behaviour through things like entertainment, but for that we'd need another hour. So now I'll hand over to Matt, and he can talk about marketing as a driver of the behavioural crisis. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joseph. So I'm going to share my screen quickly now. Bear with me if the system works. Bear with me. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see that clearly. All clear? Hope so. So as we just heard from Joseph around the kind of the bigger picture, that there's really a need we see for some more urgency and I guess some fresh thinking, and what you're about to see overall is a call for collaboration, really. We'd like to take a look at some of the standout themes, but really in doing so, call for new areas of collaboration and exploration. The statement on screen is the absolute key for me. So if anybody's only got about 6 seconds attention, as is true for many of us at the moment, and doesn't have time to read the paper, it's about the intentional exploitation of previously adaptive human impulses. And Joseph mentioned that because it's so pivotal. And in a nutshell, that statement is the behavioural crisis that we're talking about. Expressed this way, and perhaps buried 200 words deep into a paper like ours, it can feel a little bit abstract or a little bit conceptual. And part of what I want to talk about now is, as a advertising person, as a marketing person, I see it all around us. So this morning on my way to work, I walked past the Foot Locker shoe shop here in Sydney. You guys probably have an equivalent sneaker store near you that you can relate to. And thinking about that statement and walking around that store, I, for example, see messaging around fresh kicks, new sneakers. And it seems at some point in the last few years, younger generations established a social norm where apparently everybody wants to wear new, clean trainers every single day. And Joseph talked about being kind of wary or skeptical of things we consider normal. And I think this is a really nice example. The statement talks about previously adaptive impulses. And that there's really good ways of us understanding this, because humans and animals and birds have always employed what's called costly signaling, showing others you've got status through ornamentation. So much like in a load of other areas, marketers have co-opted or exploited those previously adaptive behaviors to stand out, to signal attractiveness, virtue, dominance, or sex appeal. So when I see that messaging around fresh kicks, when I walk into that sneaker store, I see some norms being quite craftily established around changing your footwear regularly. I see some status being attached to having clean, brand new looking shoes. And I see that popular notion of having a wardrobe full of fresh sneakers being around. I guess it's an attempt to shift that behavior in the way Joseph's talking about. And I'm trying to ground some of what we're talking about in everyday things we can see. And to that extent, apparently I saw some advertising around something called Fresh Kicks Friday. So we're having that normalized, the idea that we wear new shoes on a Friday. And all of that represents the intentional exploitation of previously adaptive human impulses. I find that when it's something I've seen, I can't unsee it. And arguably, as things stand, we're doing very little about it. We make the point in the paper, and this is a really big theme for us here, that this can get very sophisticated. My recent ex-colleagues in the commercial world are very, very practiced at changing behavior. there's an established, if informal, playbook most marketers use every single day to do this. The marketing industry is very good at building habits, at shifting norms. This is something else we spoke about recently. At the end of last year, we were looking here, for example, at Google search volume for the term Black Friday. So the shopping ritual in many markets where people learn to anticipate a certain sale or a certain set of behaviors around consumption. It's funny how it feels like an institution, but it's actually very, very new in our lives. And these sort of things are huge contributors to Overshoot. And again, to echo Joseph's point, we should be really, really critical of the things we consider to be normal right now. It's all the same playbook at work. So we talk about behavioral change. I see it when I see an advertisement that uses a behavioral device called framing. 98% fat-free sounds so much more appealing than milk that has 2% fat. And we see it elsewhere. I see it when Procter & Gamble tell me their toothpaste gives me confidence, as opposed to talking about the functional benefit of the ingredients in the tube. Again, the intentional exploitation of previously adaptive human impulses. And I see it everywhere. The role of marketing at the heart of behavioral crisis. So that's the logic of the paper. And the big question I'd like to get us thinking about, and we talk a lot about, is, wouldn't it be great if we could reduce these outlandish appetites we've built with the same mechanisms that built them? That's where I get excited. There's obviously a pleasing kind of symmetry in this. It could feel a little bit reductive. It's an elegant thought, but I think it's a lot more than that. And there is precedent within the marketing industry. So if we think about, for example, messaging and framing that helps us make positive, progressive changes. Some of you may have encountered a Netflix show. It's called The Game Changers, and it establishes some really aspirational norms around a so-called plant-based diet. We watch it and we go from thinking veganism feels perhaps a little bit fringe, a little bit kooky, to being told a plant-based diet will make me a dominant athlete. And we get back to that signaling, that costly signaling again. Likewise, government marketers do this really, really well. The COI, the Centre of Information in the UK, were getting very good at this around the time I started working. And we now know that if you want to stop people smoking, you'd be far more successful talking about the better relationships, the better health you'll enjoy, the things you stand to gain from your change in behavior. So the smoking advert in the bottom right there, it's hard to read, reads, "Every cigarette you don't smoke is doing you good." We know because of loss aversion, that works so much better than if you tell people cigarettes are harming them or just straight out tell them to quit. And this is an example of marketing shifting behavior norms, and it was an incredibly successful technique. Bit of kind of honesty here. We can sometimes struggle to scale some of the progressive work that brings us together today or that similar groups work on. It can sometimes, from time to time, given the scale of our challenges that Joseph talked about and the urgency, it can feel quite small and slow. And I think while the things I've just shared sound incremental, like small tweaks, they're changing a word here and there. I'm here to say that if you repeat them billions of times every day, the effect on the world is profound. And marketers and marketing operators are very good at doing that. I used the word billions earlier, and that's not hyperbole. Globally, it seems Nestle currently sell 1 billion individual products a day using some of these techniques. That's 2,000 brands across 450 factories, 188 countries. So the commercial is very good at not just changing behavior, but scaling that change. And that scale, in conjunction with some of the dynamics that Nandita is about to talk about, is really pertinent here. And they're not just good at scaling change, they're good at scaling it fast. So that sense of urgency that Joseph outlined, marketers don't hang about. They can test, learn, iterate, and get things live in the time it takes us to debate whether something is a polycrisis or a meta-crisis. I know Joseph hates that example, but it's it's very, very apt here. So I'm here to tell us, I suppose, to provoke us around the notion that we can probably learn a little from the grubby commercial world. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to turn, well, before I finish and hand to Nandita, I just wanted to kind of cover a quick sobering slide that covers the why now, why this angle, where did we begin? There have been 46 scientists' warning papers published since 1992. I was 11 years old when the first one was published, and something's broken when we are talking about that span of times and that level of urgency. So as we recognise in the paper, there's this apparent gulf between two groups in society. There are those of you and us that know, the experts, the scientists, the academics, the people that have been talking for all those years about the problem. A small, relatively small group telling us collectively, desperately, that we need to act. And then way down the other end of some sort of information continuum, we have everybody else. So the people that need to change, and there's billions of us. And somewhere between the two, the link is broken. Putting out warning after warning hasn't seemed to translate into behavior change. Slow incremental shifts to awareness and understanding, as Joseph said, don't always change behavior. And it strikes me that information isn't moving through our society in the way it once did. So our message here, I suppose, is that after 46 warnings, a fresh approach is needed. And part of that is some nice language that our colleague Phoebe had around odd bedfellows. So what we're doing here is calling for more collaboration. We're calling for ways to connect scientists and storytellers. And as I see it, part of this conversation has been perhaps missing a marketing or behavioural science skill set. And the reason I come to this, I suppose, is because those 46 scientist warnings occupy an imaginary make-believe world of perfect attention, the world that probably existed before we all had supercomputers with really captivating videos in our pockets. And if that ever existed before, it certainly doesn't exist now. And the relevant part there is the marketing industry represents a group of attention brokers. So we're talking here about experts in behavioural science, skillful storytellers, people who, without being reductive, can make complex stuff simple and move fast and put those stories in conspicuous places. So we don't necessarily have all the answers here. It's important to remember it's a call for collaboration. It's been wonderfully received so far, as Joseph says, and I encourage you to read the paper if you haven't. It's in the sidebar. And I think we wanted to say that when we get the story right, we move really quickly. So let's go. And the most important part of this that we really want to end on before we move anywhere near the Q&A is to talk about population and the role population plays as a modifier to some of these dynamics. And I'll hand over to Nandita to take us through that now. As soon as I can stop sharing my screen. Nandita, you might just need to share yours, I think.
Sure thing. All right. Well, thank you both for that. And thank you everyone for joining us. It's lovely to see a lot of familiar faces, not faces, but names, hopefully faces later. And as I said earlier, I'm the Executive Director of Population Balance. I'll be talking about the key components, the key pillars of work that we do at Population Balance, which is using an anti-oppression lens to draw the connections between pronatalism, something I'll talk about today, human supremacy or human exceptionalism, and overpopulation. And we are the first and only organization that is drawing the connections between those three things, and also looking at population denial in the mix as something that I'll be talking about as a deterrent to move forward for both human and non-human, animal, as well as ecosystem liberation. So on that note, I'll also mention that we run a very popular podcast called the Overpopulation Podcast, where we interview a lot of experts on many of the issues that I'll be talking about today. And since Bill Rees is one of the co-authors and an incredible influence on my own education on ecological overshoot, you will see him appearing a few times, not on the call, but in the form of audios that I've collected from him. So today I'll cover just very briefly what Joseph already talked about, but just in visual, what it looks like in terms of human expansionism. Then I'll discuss why population has become such a taboo and a difficult thing to talk about, and how do we confront these ideologies, move beyond them, and as Matt said, create a new story. So very briefly, we have been around as Homo sapiens for a very long time, 250 to 300,000 years. For most of our history, we existed as hunter-gatherer societies and lived in small tribes of 10 to 50 people. And our population for 99.9% of our human history remained less than 1 million. I live in Toronto, Canada. The population here is 3 million. So imagine a third of that for the entire world for most of our human history. And then a number of things happened. I won't go into that today, but really with the start of the agricultural revolution, which was the first break that we made from nature when we started to dominate the non-human animals, followed by patriarchy, religion, scientific revolution, and really the Industrial Revolution that caused us, for the most part, to explode both in our population and our consumption. And it was the access to cheap, abundant fossil fuel energy that allowed us to grow in population from 1 billion to 8 billion in just 200 years. So Joseph made a point earlier that this is the most abnormal or anomalous period of our human history. And this is what that looks like. And I'm going to let Bill Rees explain exactly what I just said.
I think it's really interesting to look historically at this whole question of growth, because for all intents and purposes, there was none for 250,000 years. In just the last 200 years, we've seen more change than in the previous entire history of human beings. Only 10 generations of human beings out of thousands have experienced this phenomenon of growth. Growth in population, growth in technology, in sufficient quantity so that they would notice in the course of their lifetimes. And so it's really a very, very recent phenomenon. But because all of us alive today and for the past few generations have been embedded within this growth dynamic, we take it to be the norm. And therefore, we project ourselves into the future as if it can continue forever. But the fact is that this is the single most abnormal period in human history. It's completely unprecedented, never occurred before, and can never occur again.
Okay, so with that context,
I think it's really interesting
what that ecological overshoot looks like. And many of you will be familiar with, if you've read the paper, that we are in 75% overshoot. That means we're demanding 75% more from the planet than it can replenish annually. And over just the last 200 years, during that anomalous period, our population grew by a factor of 8, and our consumption grew by a factor of 100. And often, especially in today's political climate, we often get into these debates. Is it population? Is it consumption? And there's a lot of denialism when it comes to discussing population, and there's good reason for it. And part of that reason is that, you know, a lot of the climate change issues that we're experiencing today were primarily driven by the inequitable distribution of wealth and emissions within the globe. So we've got industrialized, rich, high-emitting countries that have, for the most part, contributed to the climate change up until today. But to continue to believe that consumption is the only issue and that population doesn't matter is as if to say that it's not the people who are the consumers and want to consume more. And this kind of a fruitless debate is really a false dichotomy. And a good reason for that is currently, we know that much of the emissions, especially climate change, and remember, Joseph already said climate change is one aspect of ecological overshoot. We have a lot of other global issues that we're experiencing, biodiversity loss, species extinction, that cannot singularly be blamed on consumption alone. But with climate change alone, if we were to look at, the global middle class is the largest growing demographic group in the coming years, right now and in the coming years. And within just this decade, by 2030, we're expected to add almost 1 billion more people to the global middle class. 90%, almost 90% of the next billion people that will be joining the middle class, that will be living like Canadians, Americans, Australians, etc., who take flights, who have cars, who consume animal products, will be coming primarily from Asia, India, and China, mainly. And for reference, the population of the US is about 360 million. So that's 2 more American country worth of people being added to that lifestyle. And so, you know, basically the debate that it's this or that really needs to be challenged, because people at all living standards wish to increase their consumption to improve their living standard. And it's not an ideological position. A lot of people say, well, population, anybody who talks about population has nefarious motives. It's become cool to denigrate population advocates by calling them all sorts of names, whether it's eco-fascist, racist, neo-Malthusian, you name it. But this is not an ideological position. We've got some of the top eminent scientists, the Royal Society, IPCC, the UN, talking about the role that population plays driving all of the different crises that we're experiencing. And we've, in my work, we look directly at what is driving population denial, and we talk to experts like these to unpack population denial in our podcast, which for further interest, you can go and check that out. But I'll talk briefly about the 3 things that we at Population Balance are looking at as drivers of population denial. One being human supremacy, the other being past policies, and the third being pronatalism, which is my area of research. So human supremacy, according to Dr. Eileen Christ, is a worldview that esteems the humans as a distinguished entity that is superior to all other life forms and is entitled to use them and the places they live. In a kind of a larger context, I'm going to play another clip by Bill Rees as to how it shows up. in our thinking.
Sure. I think it's really important to emphasize something that you've alluded to here, and that is that human beings are storytellers. We don't live in reality the way other species do. We make up stories, and then we live out of those confections as if they were the real thing. And exceptionalism, the word you used, is one of those stories. So it's a philosophical concept, I suppose, with deep roots in religion, but it subscribes to the belief that human beings are outside of nature. We're not like other organisms. Many people don't like to think of themselves as animals, for example. And once you've developed a story that puts you outside of nature, then clearly you are, I suppose, liberated from the laws of nature, biophysics, physics, and so on and so forth. So here we are, a species that is unique in the world as far as we know, in that it considers itself to be not part of the system of which it is deeply a part. So the story deviates enormously from the reality. And I think that's a major source of many of our problems.
And in very simple, the simplest graphic that depicts what human supremacy looks like is this graphic, which shows that in terms of the total biomass or weight of all the mammals on Earth today, we and the animals that we kill for food constitute 96%, and only 4% are free-living wild animals. That number is completely flipped from 10,000 years ago, before we started to domesticate animals and started engaging in the kind of the human domination project, when this number represented 99%, and we were a mere 1%. An important, but a not insignificant part, but a small part of a rich biodiverse planet. We've covered human supremacy in large part, and it shows up in a lot of different ways, such as technological fundamentalism, such as green growth today. And here are some resources for folks to delve more deeply into. But the second one, I think it's the most common one that makes people the most nervous when they shy away from talking about population, is past policies. So when we first started recognizing that population was an issue, which was in the 40s, 50s, 60s, soon after the UN was formed, demography was a huge part of the UN mission, and a lot of different policies were put into place to address all sorts of issues that were being caused by population, both environmental, but also human well-being. And there were, of course, policies like China's one-child policy or the forced sterilization campaign in India and Puerto Rico, which is what most people remember, but majority of the policies that were actually really successful were empowering, rights valuing policies, such as in Thailand, Costa Rica, Bangladesh, Indonesia, etc. There are tons of countries and examples. And these were far more prevalent than the one-off exceptions that have left and tainted the population movement, really, with the blemish of coercion. And people were just nervous that coercion was the only thing that would be used in order to address population issues. And you add to that the layers of eugenics mentality, the history of slavery, and the attack on reproductive rights of marginalized communities, and you have a lot of people wondering whether talking about population slips into the territory of using coercion, despite the fact that we have overwhelming proof that most population policies were empowering and led to a significant decline in fertility rate by confronting patriarchal norms. In fact, efforts to increase birth rates throughout the last millennia, the 4,000 to 6,000 years, have been far more prevalent compared to efforts to lower birth rates. So if we're talking about reproductive rights, we should be focusing on both sides of the equation. And that is what brings me to the next piece, which is pronatalism. But I'm just going to talk quickly, play a quick clip by Angela Saini, who introduces how pronatalism really came to be.
The idea of a gender division of labour is actually a relatively recent one. The big turning point comes with the emergence of the first states. That's at least where we can see it in the record very clearly. You can imagine in those very early states, what were the big concerns of the elites who were trying to form those states? Obviously, population must have been very high up that agenda, because if you're creating a society in which you need people to create a surplus for those at the top, in which you need people to be available to defend the state and die for it if necessary, then you need people. They are the number one valuable commodity right throughout history. So, of course, over these thousands of years, you see pressure fall on young women to have as many children as possible, which in hunter-gatherer societies, otherwise they do not do. And also pressure falls on young men to be available to defend the state.
And so that started about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. And so this is something that's been going on for millennia, and something that's become deeply internalized. This idea that all of us are wired to want and have children.
The idea.
And so that brings me to the last part of the presentation, which is pronatalism. And according to author Laura Carroll, pronatalism is the idea that parenthood and raising children should be the central focus of every person's adult life. It is a strong social force and includes a collection of beliefs so embedded that they've come to be seen as true. So the key component here is that pronatalism is an ideology. It's an institutional force that uses reproductive capacity to grow other power structures. Challenging pronatalism is not an attack on parenthood or reproductive choice. Rather, challenging pronatalism liberates reproductive choice so that people can make whatever decision, whether or not to have children, through informed knowledge. Often people think when you're challenging pronatalism that you are advocating for antinatalism, or saying that nobody should be having children because it's simply unethical. We reject both of those as autonomy diminishing ideologies that take away people's choice by pushing their own ideologies. So we reject both of those and fight for both autonomy and responsibility. Pronatalism shows up in a number of ways through cultural pressures, whether it's from family, whether it's religious pressures, through myths about contraceptives, abortion bans, the exaltation of large families. Corporations always want more consumers, so it shows up in that way. And then we hear a lot, currently we're hearing a lot of nationalism at play as countries are seeing declining fertility rates, that we're not producing enough taxpayers, or our military strength is declining, or that we want more of our kind of people because of xenophobia, etc. So it shows up in a number of ways. And that's why it's important to understand how deeply it diminishes autonomy when it's everywhere, basically telling us that this is what we should be doing. This is a quick movie clip that shows how pronatalism shows up in contemporary culture. So these are news headlines that were taken just from the last 6 months of what politicians are up to, that shows how deeply pronatalist our societies are and what they're willing to do. And we're seeing a lot in terms of, abortion bans. I wrote an article with the overturning of Roe v. Wade that abortion bans are actually simply a natural outgrowth of coercive pronatalism, as much as many, religious adherents might say that it's about sanctity of life of the unborn, etc. While that may be true for some, you can see from these quotes. This is a conservative chairman, Matt Schlapp in US. If you say that there's a population problem in a country, but you're killing millions of your own people through legalized abortion every year, well, if that were to be reduced, some of that problem is solved. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the greatest propagandist of our time, Elon Musk. Population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. The urge to have sex and procreate has been subverted by birth control and abortion, leading to population decline. So gender equality, feminism, etc., are a threat to civilization. And to end off, I'd like to just show a quote here that's used by a very popular environmentalist and Guardian columnist, George Monbiot, who has a ton of influence, who says it's no coincidence that most of those who are obsessed with overpopulation are post-reproductive, wealthy, white men. Well, I'm 42. I might be post-reproductive, but I'm not none of the other three things. And I'm pretty obsessed with overpopulation because of what it means for reproductive rights and the well-being of humans and non-humans around the world. So I'd like to actually spin the population myth and say, yeah, the people who are actually obsessed with increasing population are the kind of people that Monbiot is talking about. And by not talking about population, here's a quote from a recent paper that my colleague and I wrote. Those who silence discussions about overpopulation are themselves carrying water for pronatalist and patriarchal forces that insist women's primary and inarguable function is to bear children for institutional growth. So here are some podcasts that we've done that challenge pronatalism and patriarchy. And in order to confront the ideology, I'm going to just skip over to the last slide here. These are the graphs. This is the graph from the UN with its projected population. Business as usual takes us to about 11 billion by the end of the century. If the likes of Elon Musk have their way and we start seeing more coercive pronatalist policies like abortion bans, we could be heading towards 16 billion, although I'm not sure Earth would allow us to go there. And with more empowering policies through better storytelling, we could confront patriarchal norms and get us down to 6 billion, or according to some of our other colleagues, even 3 billion soon after 2100. Something that's not unimaginable because that number, 3 billion, 4 billion was where we were at just 50, 60 years ago. So within our own, last 50 years, we've doubled. And I'm going to end off, actually, I'm not going to show this video, but I would like to highlight Bill Ryerson, who is from Population Media Center, whose Population Media Center is an incredible organization that is actually using the power of storytelling. It's the same kind of tactics that Matt was talking about of behavior change, except that's based in ethics and improves self-efficacy rather than manipulates us into doing something that is not good for us. And as are these other incredible men.
Okay, well, thank you. We've gone over. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in this issue and lots of questions. And as you say, we're all on a journey here, and you're identifying the population issue, the economy issue, the influence from marketing are all critically important aspects of how we're going to get this tiger by the tail. So thanks again to the three of you for the important work that you're doing. Thanks to all those that asked questions and contributed to the evening. And thank you all for attending and your interest. And no doubt you'll carry on looking at these issues, investigating them, and doing what you can to move them in the right direction. So thanks one and all. And we'll continue the series and see where we go. Good
Thank
wishes.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.